Hello everyone. I know you're so excited to be watching this video, but you should have already noticed that it's quite short. So my goal is to be done in less than 15 minutes. I think I can do it. The next video is a little bit longer, and also, just so you know, the next video is taken from a course that I taught online in the past, so don't be confused if I refer to it being, a certain week of the course or something like that. The material is still relevant for this class, but this video is made special just for you. All I want to do is talk a little bit about some of the aspects of early medieval life that we didn't quite get to in class on Wednesday and that you'll be reading about in Friday's reading. So I want to start with Charlemagne. We discussed Charlemagne fairly thoroughly in class, but in neither section did I have a chance to talk about some of his most important cultural and educational achievements. The question I posed in class is, why do we call him Charlemagne, Charles the Great? I talked about some of his military victories. I talked about his alliance with the papacy. But we need to recognize his achievements in the realm of culture and education. He attracted some of the best scholars from all across Europe, including people like Alcuin, whom I did mention in class. He brought them to his court, and he brought them to do a couple of different things. For one thing, he wanted these scholars to go through a bunch of manuscripts and correct them, because many manuscripts had been corrupted with errors and things like that. And so he wanted to have good, reliable, consistent manuscripts of important text, theological or scriptural, whatever. He also wanted to create a script that would be more legible than the scripts that were currently being used, where there were no spaces between words, no punctuation, very, very difficult to read. So he had his scholars develop a new script known as the Carolingian minuscule, which is actually the origin of our lowercase letters. And thereby they created a script that was much easier on the eyes, much easier to read for people like priests who would be reading scripture aloud in church. And speaking of church, one of the main reasons why he wanted to bring about a higher standard of education in his reign is because there was a big problem. There was a shortage of literate people, which was a bureaucratic problem for him. He needs, as king, good, capable bureaucrats who can read and write effectively. But in the church, there were priests who could not read the Bible. And that's obviously a problem. So one of the things that he tapped Alcuin to do was to create schools, and this is very innovative, free schools open to any freeborn children, so that he might increase the standard of literacy and culture in his reign. So we need to give him a little credit where credit is due there. And all of these educational and cultural reforms are often described as the Carolingian Renaissance. So this is a real high point of learning in the early Middle Ages. This is where most of the really important medieval theological and philosophical writings come from the period of around the time of Charlemagne. And of course, he's from the Carolingian dynasty, so that is why it's called the Carolingian Renaissance. Okay, enough about Charlemagne. Let me just touch on a couple of things that you're going to be reading about for Friday. I want to shift from sort of the political and cultural and religious realm to the social realm. I want to talk a little bit about two of the most important social systems that we see emerging in the early Middle Ages. specifically around the time of Charlemagne. So these are two distinct social systems, but as we will see, they interlock. They are distinct, but they are interdependent. The first I want to talk about is manorialism. M-A-N-O-R-I-A-L-I-S-M, manorialism. We have to keep in mind that most people in the Middle Ages, the vast majority of the populace, were agricultural workers. They worked the land. Most of them did not own their own land, but rather worked on land that was owned by another. They worked on what is called a manor. This would be an estate owned by a lord. Sometimes the lord would actually live on the manor, but sometimes the lord would be absent for long periods of time. The lord could be just a local aristocrat, but could also be a religious figure. It could be a bishop or an abbot. The church was one of the major landowners of the Middle Ages. I want to encourage you to stop what you're doing if you don't have West in the World with you. To get this out, pause the video, and look at the diagram on page 223, which shows you what a medieval manor would have looked like. And you can see that the agricultural land is sort of divided into these strips. And so the idea was that the tenant farmers, so those who didn't own the land but who worked on the land, were assigned certain strips, and they were allowed to work that plot of the land. Now, technically, again, it's still the Lord's land, but they were able to keep most of the produce that they labored for themselves. Now, by the time we get to the end of the early Middle Ages, so around the year 1000, most of these peasants who work the land but don't own it are also serfs. Now, serfs are not, strictly speaking, slaves. They did not have a personal owner who essentially owned their bodies and can do whatever they wanted to with them. But in another sense, they were slaves. And in fact, the word from which serf is derived, servus in Latin, S-E-R-V-U-S, is actually a word for slave. What was slave-like about this relationship? Well, for one thing, serfs were not free to leave the manor. So they couldn't just pull up stakes and move somewhere else. They had made a commitment to remain on the manor of their landlord. They also had certain obligations, like giving a certain percentage of their produce to the Lord. And there were some other fees and obligations that were imposed on these serfs as well. For instance, if a family member died, you actually owed a special tax to the landlord because the landlord has just lost some labor. So not the most just social arrangement, but it was a very pervasive social arrangement in the early Middle Ages and beyond. Now, of course, landlords don't just need workers, they also need protection. And we're talking about a world in which there is no such thing as an organized police force, no real law enforcement in the modern sense. And so this brings us to the second social system I want to mention, the social system that addresses that need for protection. And that social system is feudalism. F-E-U-D-A-L-I-S-M. So if manorialism names the relationship between the landlord and his serfs, feudalism names the relationship between landlords and the knights who are to protect them. Now, the main obligation of the knight was to offer military protection, but knights were expected to offer other kinds of aid as well, including just giving advice and counsel to the Lord when he needs it. So it worked like this. The knight would agree to serve and protect and advise a lord, and in return, the knight typically would receive a fief, F-I-E-F, which was a gift normally in the form of land. Okay? So this is a military service for land kind of arrangement. It was, in fact, a kind of quid pro quo. Now, the lord-vassal relationship, and so here in the feudal relationship, the landlord, of course, is the lord, and the inferior of a lord is known as a vassal, and the vassal in this situation is the knight. And this lord-vassal relationship in many ways resembles the patronage relationships that we studied in the Roman world. Okay, so yes, these are reciprocal relationships. One party has one thing to offer the other party has something to offer the other. But these were also personal relationships, and these were long-lasting relationships. So you would not typically, if you were, say, a knight, serve a lord for a year and then move on somewhere else. I mean, I'm sure that happened occasionally, but that was not really the ideal. And as you can see on page 226 of West in the World, this system could become quite complex indeed, because you could have a situation where someone is both a lord and vassal at the same time. So you could be a vassal of the king who is the ultimate lord. So you would be the king's vassal, but if you're the king's vassal, you're probably a pretty well-connected and wealthy person, and so you're able to have vassals of your own. So there is a kind of complexity that was sometimes at work. So this is a social system, along with manorialism, that did not sort of spring up overnight. And these relationships and these social systems did not form because, some committee got together and decided that these are the best social systems for the Middle Ages. Rather, these are social systems that evolved and evolved gradually over centuries. But we can say that by the Carolingian age, both of these systems are discernible, both manorialism and feudalism. And as we move on into the High Middle Ages, which is defined as the period from 1000 to 1300, we'll see these social systems continue to thrive and remain in place. All right, that was not only under 15 minutes, that was under 14 minutes. So you're very welcome. Now you can take your quiz, or if you're watching this Thursday, you'll have to wait till Friday. But the quiz is meant to be very easy, so nothing to worry about. If you paid attention to this, you should be in good shape. All right.